9 ships. That's the number a maritime risk executive gave in a briefing to shipping insurers just last week, describing every commercial vessel that's come under attack in the Strait of Hormuz since July 6th alone. Not since this war started back in February. Since July 6th. A little over 2 weeks, 9 separate ships hit, and the man running one of the region's leading maritime risk firms told Lloyd's List Intelligence directly that the security situation has returned to what he called a worst-case scenario for oil tankers. So today we're going through the ships themselves, the companies that got hit twice in a single day, the crews that had to abandon ship in the middle of the strait, and the actual diplomatic dispute sitting underneath all of it that nobody's actually resolved yet. Before we even get into the individual ships, it's worth putting that 9-ship figure in perspective against the strait's overall importance. This isn't some minor regional shipping lane, it's the single narrowest choke point for a huge share of the entire planet's oil and gas exports, the one stretch of water where a handful of miles separates safe passage from a war zone. 9 attacks against commercial shipping there in barely more than 2 weeks isn't just a bad month for a handful of unlucky vessels. It's a direct hit against the plumbing that keeps a meaningful fraction of the global economy actually running. Stick with me, because this story moves fast, and it's still moving right now. Every claim here is sourced to named outlets and named officials, and I'll flag clearly anywhere the reporting is still unconfirmed, because with a story unfolding this quickly, that distinction matters. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell you something the individual incidents alone don't. According to Dimitris Maniatis, chief executive of the Athens-based maritime risk firm Marisks, speaking at a Lloyd's List intelligence briefing, at least 9 ships have come under attack in the Strait of Hormuz since July 6th, as Iran tries to force vessels to navigate the strait specifically through its own territorial waters rather than the internationally recognized shipping lanes. Maniatis said plainly that crews of vessels transiting the strait are even more concerned now than they were before, and that the volume of transits through Hormuz has already measurably dropped as a direct result. Think about what it actually takes for a shipping executive to use the phrase worst-case scenario in a formal industry briefing. That's not a headline writer reaching for dramatic language. That's someone whose entire job is calculating risk for a living, someone who has presumably sat through plenty of previous rounds of Gulf tension over the years, telling the industry's own insurers and underwriters that this specific stretch is worse than what came before it. So let's go through some of these 9 ships individually, because the pattern across them tells its own story. On July 7th, according to Al Jazeera's reporting citing the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Center, a tanker caught fire off the coast of Oman after being struck by what UKMTO described as an unknown projectile. Separately, Axios reported, citing 2 unnamed U.S. officials, that Iran's Revolutionary Guard fired at least 2 missiles at commercial ships transiting the strait that same night, with 2 vessels suffering significant damage. It wasn't immediately clear whether that was the same incident UKMTO had reported. 3 separate sources told Reuters. The specific tanker involved was a Qatari-flagged vessel called the Al Raqayat, carrying liquefied natural gas, with the crew reported safe, but the ship itself at risk of exploding due to a fire that had reached its engine room. A liquefied natural gas tanker, specifically, is worth pausing on for a second, because LNG carriers aren't like other cargo ships. They're floating pressurized containers of highly flammable gas, built with serious safety redundancies, precisely because a catastrophic failure on one of these vessels isn't just a shipping loss. It's a potential humanitarian and environmental disaster in one of the busiest waterways on the planet. An engine room fire on a fully loaded LNG carrier is about as close to a worst-case outcome as this specific class of incident gets, short of an actual explosion. Oman's own capital, Muscat, sits close enough to several of these incidents that its own Coast Guard and Navy have ended up doing much of the actual rescue work throughout this crisis, even though Oman itself isn't a direct party to the war. Muscat has functioned as one of the primary diplomatic backchannels between Washington and Tehran throughout this entire conflict, and now its own maritime forces are increasingly the ones pulling stranded crews out of the water in the strait, right off its coastline. Then less than 2 weeks later, the exact same pattern hit one shipping company twice in a single day. According to Seatrade Maritime's own reporting, the Dynacom product tanker Kavomaleas, owned by the George Procopio-controlled shipping group, was hit in the Strait of Hormuz on July 19th, causing a fire on board and forcing the crew to abandon ship. Less than 24 hours later, on July the 20th, a second Dynacom vessel, the VLCC Akaluz, had its steering gear damaged after being struck by an unknown projectile roughly 17 nautical miles east of Dibba in the UAE. 2 tankers from the same company hit within a single day of each other. According to that same reporting, all crew members from both vessels were reported safe, and UKMTO stated there was no environmental impact from either incident. Getting hit once in a war zone is a statistic. Getting hit twice within 24 hours, as the same company, tells you something closer to a targeting pattern, or at minimum, tells you that whoever's carrying out these attacks isn't being especially selective about which flag or which owner sits behind any individual vessel transiting that specific stretch of water. Put yourself in the position of a shipping executive managing a fleet through this exact stretch of water right now. Losing one vessel to an attack is a crisis you manage through insurance claims and crew support. Losing two within a single day is the kind of event that forces an entire company to reconsider whether any of its remaining ships should be anywhere near that waterway at all, regardless of what any individual voyage's cargo contract is worth. That's exactly the kind of calculation playing out across dozens of shipping companies right now, not just Dynacom, every single time a new incident like this one gets reported. And it kept going. According to FreightWave's own reporting, Iran attacked a feeder container ship called the GFS Galaxy on a Saturday as it was transiting the Strait, with British security monitors reporting the vessel had been set on fire and the crew forced to abandon ship. That specific ship, owned by a company based in the United Arab Emirates, was en route on a service connecting ports across Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Malaysia, China, and South Korea. According to that same reporting, this marked the first attack specifically on container shipping in the Strait since May 6th, when crew members were injured in a separate attack on the CMA CGM San Antonio. That same weekend, Iran formally declared the entire strait closed to vessel traffic and expanded its missile and drone attacks to hit Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, and Jordan, all within the same general window. Markets reacted to that specific weekend almost instantly. According to FreightWaves, Brent crude futures jumped roughly 12% since the preceding Friday. European natural gas prices spiked nearly 70% over that same span, and U.S. gasoline futures climbed around 10%. Those aren't small movements. A 70% jump in European gas prices inside a single weekend is the kind of number that shows up directly on household energy bills within weeks, not months, for millions of people who have absolutely no connection to this war beyond, depending on the same global energy market it's currently disrupting. It's worth putting those specific percentages side by side too, because the gap between them tells its own story. Oil moving 12% and gasoline moving 10% are large, but not unprecedented swings for a single volatile weekend in energy markets. Natural gas jumping nearly 70% in the same window is a different order of magnitude entirely, and it reflects just how tightly European gas supply in particular has been squeezed by a war happening thousands of miles away. A continent that spent years working to reduce its dependence on a small handful of supply routes found one of its remaining alternatives suddenly looking far less secure over a single weekend, and the price response reflected exactly how little slack was left in that system to absorb the shock. Now, let's talk about a ship whose story is still actively unfolding as of this recording, because it's one of the more dramatic individual incidents in this entire wave. According to AFP's reporting, a Thai-registered bulk carrier called the Mayuri Nari was attacked while transiting the Strait of Hormuz after departing Khalifa Port in the UAE, headed toward Kandla in India. Photos released by Thailand's own Royal Navy showed heavy black smoke billowing from the vessel's hull and superstructure, with life rafts floating in the water around it. The Omani Navy, operating out of bases near Muscat, rescued 20 crew members from that ship, with rescue efforts continuing at the time of that report for the remaining 3 crew members still unaccounted for. Thailand's Navy said the specific details and cause of the attack were still under investigation as of that report, and it wasn't immediately clear whether this incident was one of 3 separate commercial ships that UKMTO had separately reported being hit in the Gulf that same day. A Thai-flagged bulk carrier is worth sitting with for a moment because Thailand has no direct stake in this war whatsoever. It's not a Gulf state. It's not allied against Iran in any formal sense. It's a country roughly 3,000 miles away whose only connection to this specific conflict is that one of its shipping companies, Precious Shipping, had a vessel transiting a waterway that happens to carry a significant share of the entire world's energy trade. 20 crew members needing rescue, with 3 more still missing at last report, on a ship whose home country has nothing to do with why this war started in the first place. Let's zoom out now and talk about why this specific wave of attacks is happening right now, because there's an actual diplomatic dispute sitting underneath all of it that explains the timing. According to CNBC's own reporting, the United States and Iran are currently disputing exactly how the Strait of Hormuz is supposed to reopen under a memorandum of understanding the 2 countries signed back on June 17th. Under that agreement, Tehran promised safe passage to vessels transiting the strait, but according to that same reporting, the actual deal never defined which specific lanes vessels were supposed to use to receive the safe passage guarantee. Sit with that gap for a second, because it's not a minor technicality. A memorandum promising safe passage without specifying the actual routes that guarantee applies to is functionally an agreement that both sides can interpret however serves them best. Iran appears to be using that ambiguity to insist ships transit specifically through its own territorial waters, according to Maniatis' own comments, which would give Tehran direct control and monitoring over every vessel passing through. Shipping companies and their insurers, understandably, aren't eager to route hundreds of millions of dollars of cargo and crew directly through Iranian-controlled waters on the strength of a promise with no defined boundaries attached to it. That single undefined clause in a memorandum signed more than a month ago is arguably doing more to keep this specific crisis alive than any individual missile or drone strike. Diplomats and lawyers draft documents like this one under real-time pressure, often trying to lock in a ceasefire or a framework agreement before a fragile moment of goodwill disappears entirely. The pressure can produce exactly this kind of gap, a broad commitment everyone can agree to in principle, with the genuinely hard technical details, in this case the actual navigational lanes, a safe passage guarantee would cover, left for a follow-up negotiation that never quite happens before the situation deteriorates again. Whether that gap in the June 17th memorandum was an oversight born of urgency or a deliberate piece of ambiguity that let both sides sign something without fully committing to specifics, the practical result 5 weeks later has been the same either way. 9 ships hit and counting. According to CNBC's reporting, the U.S. has already launched 6 separate rounds of airstrikes against Iran specifically in retaliation for these tanker attacks. And Tehran has responded each time with volleys of missiles targeting American allies across the Gulf. And the danger isn't staying contained to the Strait itself either. That same reporting notes that Iran and its Houthi allies in Yemen are now threatening to shut down shipping in the Red Sea as well, a route that had become a vital alternative for Saudi oil exports specifically because of the danger in Hormuz. Larson, cited in that same CNBC piece, put it about as plainly as anyone could, saying the situation looks like it's on a path of escalation that could well grow worse with time. Think about what it means when the emergency detour itself starts becoming dangerous too. Shipping companies rerouting away from Hormuz toward the Red Sea were already accepting added time and cost as the price of avoiding this exact crisis. If that alternate route becomes a genuine threat as well, there isn't really a safe path left connecting Gulf energy exports to the rest of the world, which is precisely the scenario that turns a regional shipping crisis into a genuine global economic one. There's a geography lesson worth spelling out here too, because it's exactly why the Red Sea threat lands as hard as it does. Ships avoiding Hormuz have 2 realistic options, and neither one is simple. They can sail the long way entirely, around the southern tip of Africa via the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to a voyage and burning through fuel and crew costs that eat directly into shipping margins. Or they can use the Red Sea and the Suez Canal as a shorter alternative, provided that route stays safe enough to use. Iran and the Houthis threatening that second option isn't just adding one more danger zone to the map. It's removing the only realistic shortcut left, pushing the entire global shipping industry back toward the much longer, much more expensive route around Africa as the only option that still looks genuinely safe. This broader disruption is already reshaping decisions well beyond the Gulf itself. According to FreightWaves, the flaring hostilities are directly shadowing Maersk's own previously announced plans to restart scheduled container services through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. The world's second largest container line had set a target date to return to that route back in January, only to pull back once security there looked too uncertain. Now, with the Strait crisis actively expanding toward that exact alternate corridor, one of the largest shipping companies on the planet finds its own recovery plans caught in the same widening danger zone it had been trying to route around in the first place. I want to slow down on the human element running through every single one of these incidents, because it's easy to let ship names and barrel counts crowd out what's actually happening to the people on board. Crews abandoning ship into life rafts in open water. A Thai crew rescued 20 at a time by Omani sailors, with 3 more still missing at last report. An engine room fire on a fully loaded LNG carrier. These are merchant sailors from countries with no direct stake in this war, doing ordinary jobs on ordinary cargo routes, who found themselves in life rafts or lifeboats because a waterway that operated safely for generations suddenly isn't safe anymore. Whatever the strategic logic driving Iran's targeting decisions or America's retaliatory strikes, that specific cost lands first and hardest on exactly these people. Merchant shipping crews are also some of the most quietly international workers on the planet, and this specific wave of attacks reflects that reality directly. A Qatari-flagged LNG carrier, 2 tankers under a Greek shipping magnate's company, a container ship registered out of the UAE, a Thai-flagged bulk carrier bound for India. 4 incidents, 4 different flags, 4 different crews likely drawn from a dozen or more nationalities between them, all converging on the exact same stretch of contested water, because that's simply where global trade happens to funnel through. None of them chose to be part of this war. All of them ended up living through some version of it anyway. So let's put the full picture together, because I think the actual story here is bigger than any single ship. 9 attacks in a little over 2 weeks. A Qatari LNG carrier nearly lost to an engine room fire. Two tankers from the same company hit within 24 hours of each other. The first container ship attack since early May. A Thai bulk carrier with crew still missing at last report. Brent crude jumping 12% and European gas spiking 70% in a single weekend. 6 rounds of American retaliatory strikes. And underneath all of it, a memorandum of understanding signed over a month ago that promised safe passage through the strait without ever actually defining which lanes that promise covers. That last detail is really the story, once you step back far enough to see it clearly. This isn't a crisis that's spiraling because diplomacy failed entirely. It's a crisis that's spiraling because one specific piece of an existing agreement was left deliberately or accidentally vague, and both sides have spent the following weeks exploiting that exact gap, with 9 commercial ships and their crews caught directly in the middle of the disagreement. Until Washington and Tehran actually sit back down and define which lanes carry that safe passage guarantee, based on everything covered in this video, there's no obvious reason to expect ship number 10 is very far away. Watch specifically for whether either government even acknowledges this lane definition gap publicly over the coming days, because that single detail will tell you more about where this is actually headed than another round of dueling strike announcements ever could. A quiet technical amendment to the June 17th memorandum, adding actual defined coordinates for safe passage, would be the single clearest signal available that both sides genuinely want this specific crisis contained. Continued silence on that exact point, while the strike and counterstrike cycle keeps running in parallel, would tell you the opposite, that neither side currently has enough incentive to close the loophole that's been doing so much of the damage. So here's what I actually want to know from you. Given that this entire escalation traces back to one undefined clause in a memorandum both countries already signed, do you think this gets resolved with a simple diplomatic fix? Actually sitting down and drawing the lines the original deal left out? Or has too much damage already been done, with too many ships hit and too much trust already burned, for a technical fix like that to actually hold at this point? Let me know your honest read in the comments, because based on the pace of this specific crisis over just the last 3 weeks, I don't think we'll be waiting long to find out. Before I wrap up, I want to be transparent about where every piece of this came from. The 9-ship count and the worst-case scenario assessment came from Dimitris Maniatis' comments at the Lloyd's List intelligence briefing, reported through CNBC. The Al Rukayat incident came from Al Jazeera and Axios, cross-referenced with Reuters' sourcing on the vessel's identity. The 2 Dynacom tanker strikes came from Seat Raid Maritime's own reporting. The GFS Galaxy attack and the market reaction came from FreightWaves. The Mayuri Neri incident came from AFP's reporting on the Royal Thai Navy's own statement, and I want to note plainly that the exact cause of that specific attack was still under investigation as of that report. And the underlying dispute over the June 17th memorandum's undefined shipping lanes came from CNBC's own reporting on the diplomatic standoff, where a detail was still unconfirmed, like whether the UKMTO report and the Axios report on July 7th described the same vessel, or whether the Mayuri Neri was among the 3 ships UKMTO separately flagged that day. I told you that plainly, rather than presenting it as settled fact. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. I'll see you in the next video.